Hi, everyone. I'm Shelly Francis. I'm founder of Creative Courage Press. Welcome to Creative Courage Live, conversations for your inner author. Thanks for being here. Today, I'm talking with Becky Robinson, author of a new book called Reach, Create the Biggest Possible Audience for Your Message, Book, or Cause. Her paperback and audio launched this week, and I'm happy to help new and aspiring authors and people like you get to know the person behind the book. Let me tell you a little bit about Becky before we get started. Becky is founder and CEO of Weaving Influence, a digital marketing agency working with authors, thought leaders, trainers, coaches, consultants, nonprofits, and training organizations since 2012. She has launched more than 150 books and provided ongoing digital marketing support to hundreds of clients. Welcome, Becky.
Shelly, it is so good to be here with you. What a great way to wrap up my launch week.
I'm so happy to get to do this with you. Becky, you and your team at Weaving Influence gave me the courage to show up as a new author 4 years ago when the Courage Way launched. And I followed your author journey the past few years, both in conversations we've had by phone, but through your blog and hearing about your journey becoming an author. So I'm really excited today to talk to you about your own creative courage as an author.
Thank you, Shelly.
So let's jump in. I want to know, what's your earliest memory of wanting to be a writer and an author?
Wow. Well, here's the earliest one, and I don't remember exactly how old I was, but do you remember in elementary school when you would have those like young writer kind of contests and everyone in school would put their own books together and bind them? I think that's probably the earliest memory I have of being in elementary school and participating in those. And at the time, crafting fiction stories. And I'm not an artist at all, but also trying to illustrate my own. I've always just loved books and loved reading as well. And I feel like part of my love of reading fueled my love of writing and caused me to hope to someday have my book in print and published.
I love that. I'm sure that goes back to elementary school for me too. So what was your path to becoming an author of Reach? And when did you find yourself needing courage in that process? Also, how did you get the courage you needed?
Well, it's been a really, really long journey, and I'm going to just kind of build on that kind of the early dreams as a child. When I was in junior high and high school, I did some creative writing camps. And then in college, I ended up graduating with my bachelor's in creative writing. And so in college, I did a lot of writing, a lot of like narrative nonfiction writing and poetry writing. But when I became an adult, and then after I got my master's degree, I really didn't write for a very long time. And then when I was in my early 30s, maybe later 30s, I can't remember now, the year was 2008, and I had stepped out of the workforce for nearly a decade to raise my 3 young children. And my husband one day said to me, Becky, what do you want to do for work when the kids are all in school? And I literally started laughing out loud at him because he had a job that had him out of the house 12 hours a day. I had these 3 young kids. I was homeschooling the 3 young kids, and I just couldn't figure out like, okay, how am I going to have a career? And so I was grasping for what I might be able to do. And, honestly, when you've had young kids and been at home for so long, there is that part of you inside that wonders when you can have something that's for you again. And I went back to those earliest dreams of writing at that time. And so I said to my husband, well, maybe I can try freelance writing. So I pitched some stories. I ended up getting a few stories in Chicago Parent Magazine because I was living in Chicago at the time. And then like through a Facebook connection, I started doing some freelance writing work. And that was back in 2009. So that really is when my journey to be a writer of this book began again. But I really had thought that I might get the opportunity to write sooner than I did. So 2009, 10, 11, I was doing blogging, writing, and starting to write ebooks. And I thought that the ebooks would, be something I could sell. And so I think it was as early as 2013 that I went to Berrett-Koehler Publishers and my now editor, Neil Mallet, and I said to him, like, hey, I have an idea for a book. And 2 or 3 times before even putting together a formal proposal, I got shut down. So, if you think about that, I started my company in 2012. I tried a few times with my editor. And just a side note, there are lots of different paths to publishing. And, I think now the ability for people to do hybrid publishing or self-publishing or use a small press like yours, Shelly, the doors are wide open for anyone. And I think that there are valid reasons to choose those publishing approaches. But for me, I really wanted to work with a traditional publisher. So that was the reason why I waited until, finally in mid 2020, I had another conversation with this editor that I knew. And at that point, he gave me the green light and said, yes, I think you finally got the right idea. I think this is finally the right time. And so I submitted a book proposal in December of 2020. I got the contract in February of 2021. And then since that time, I've been working to bring the book to market.
Yeah, you went through rejection after rejection, even though it was still from Berrett-Koehler. So what gave you the courage or the chutzpah to keep trying?
Well, I think eventually I realized that those early attempts were sort of half-baked. I think it's hard at times to have the insight into I really am not ready yet. I really don't have the ideas yet. And I wanted to be ready. I had this, you have these writing fantasies, and I could picture all the sticky notes and all the plans, and I could picture a writing cottage, which I never did have. I did all my writing at home. Mostly, in carved out hours for my work day and then evenings and weekends. But, you have this dream of what being a writer might be. And I think the reality is so different. And part of that for me was a belief that I was ready before I was ready. And I think if I had been ready, I would have potentially done it sooner and published on my own or found a different route. But it wasn't the right time yet.
Well, and Berrett-Koehler is such a great company to work with that I'm glad that that's who you got to have your experience with, and me too. I mean, I know you've worked with them a long time as a support to their authors. So it's great that you're an author of them and for yourself now.
Yeah, I've been really thrilled with that relationship and proud to be a BK author, like I know you are.
So I want to ask, what's the difference to you? And I know you cover this in your book, but what's the difference between being famous and impactful?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And, I think my husband and I had some conversations this week about, the ego associated with being a writer, and how even when people have big goals to change the world, it's really difficult to remove the ego entirely. But I think that, you can become famous without creating meaning. If you think about the Kardashians, or I don't mean to be judgmental, that's just the first name that comes to mind. If you had famous parents or you happen to be a celebrity, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're creating content that's of value to the world. And so for me, I differentiate the idea of fame from the idea of significance or impact. And I think that every one of us has the chance to become famous in our own way and to our own people. And so what I like to think about, in the original working title of my book was Famous to a Few. And the reason I liked that phrase was because I really wanted people to focus on having a big impact with the people in their networks. So there are people who know you, and there's content or value that you're offering to them. And so even if you're not going to be big name famous, I don't know, Adam Grant or Brene Brown, or, maybe those people aren't even that famous in the scheme of things. If you're not going to be famous like Tom Hanks or, I don't know, Kathy Lee Gifford. I can't really think of famous people right now, but you can be famous so that the people who are surrounding you, whether that's online or offline, you matter to them. You're adding value to them. And so the Famous to a Few title didn't make it through at the publisher. And the reason was because the sales teams thought that would be too discouraging, that people wouldn't want to just be famous to a few. We all want to believe that's where the ego comes in again. We all want to believe that we can be the breakout success, that we can be the one, who does become famous for what we do. And, maybe that will happen, and it would be great if it did. But I think what's more likely is that we'll quietly continue to add value to the people who are listening to us.
Well, I love that your book title also says that it's a reach for your message or cause, not just your book, too. So you talk in your book about 4 commitments that are needed to create and expand your online presence. Could you tell us a little bit about what those 4 commitments are and how did you land on naming them?
I would be happy to share that. Thank you, Shelly. And, I don't know if this was your experience as it relates to publishing the book. I think you told me that it was your experience, that where you are with your first draft and then where you are with your finished book are worlds apart. And I didn't think it would be that way, again, to like the ego or pride, like I'm a good writer. Of course, I'm going to write a perfect first draft. And I didn't realize how much the editorial process could improve my work. So for any who are listening who might be on the journey or thinking about a book, like there's nothing better than good editorial feedback that can help to shape your content in a more powerful way. And I'll give you an example. When I wrote the book, I called the 4 commitments the 4 factors. Like, how boring is that? How much more meaningful is it to think about, hey, these are the commitments that you need to make to create the reach that you want? So kudos to my editor for telling me that I needed a different word than 4 factors. All right, so the 4 commitments are value, consistency, generosity, and longevity. And if you like, Shelly, I can talk about each one. And then most of those names didn't change from the original version of the book, but one of them was a little bit in flux. So I'll tell you about that. So as it relates to creating traction for a message, a book, or a cause, you really do have to start with value. So if something's not any good, no one's going to be drawn to it. So, and it doesn't have to necessarily be good to every single person who reads it. There are some books that are for a specific intended audience, and that's okay. I typically will use the example of parenting. If you're a parent of a young toddler, then you might be drawn to the work of a thought leader named Elizabeth Pantley, who wrote some books like The No Cry Sleep Solution. But if you're an empty nester whose kids are long grown, then you won't find much value necessarily in Elizabeth Pantley's books. And so when we think about value, it's really value for the audience, for the work, who the work is intended for. So you have to start with value if you want to grow an audience. And to value, you have to add consistency, because in order to get people's attention, in order to have people see you in online spaces that are really noisy and crowded, the best way to break through that is to consistently show up with value. And my favorite story on this one is Dan Rockwell. I don't know, Shelly, if you worked with Dan on a blog post when your book came out. So Dan is a leadership blogger, and he blogs every single weekday. He's done it for more than a decade. And so as a result, he's been able to draw this audience of people who know they can count on Dan showing up every single morning with 300 words of content about leadership that will challenge them or inspire them or get them thinking. Now, most of us can't really create that kind of consistency, because that's like defying to me. Just this week, I did a podcast and a Facebook Live every morning to focus on my book launch journey and share that with others who might benefit from learning what the experience is like. But I can't imagine committing to do that every single weekday for the rest of my, online presence. So I really coach authors or thought leaders or cause leaders to focus on what's a sustainable approach, but in that to create consistency. People need to know that they can count on you to show up monthly with a newsletter, or that they can count on you to show up quarterly with a newsletter, or bi-weekly with a podcast episode, or for a conversation like this one, Shelly, this is the first of many. And so what I would coach you to do is come up with what's sustainable. Can you do this monthly? Can you do this quarterly? And then that consistency will help people. They'll keep showing up because you keep showing up. I never said that before. I like it. All right, so the third commitment that we have to make if we want to grow an audience and have impact in the world is generosity. And this is, sometimes a little bit unexpected. But what I have seen is that the more you can give away of your ideas, your expertise, your inspiration, your time, your energy, your content, the more you can attract people who will want to learn from you. And, sometimes this can be a little scary. And Shelly, I'm sure that we might have had this conversation with you early on. We typically, when we're working with authors, we encourage them to get a sample chapter of their book and put the sample chapter out there freely for anyone. Well, the reason is because, people don't necessarily want to give away their email address just to get a chapter of your book or a chapter of your work. And the more freely you offer that, the more likely you are that people will actually open it and read it, and those ideas will spread. So generosity is this commitment that we can make that will ensure that our ideas will get out as far as they can get out. One of the authors that I've worked with has said, if he wants to sell X number of books, he knows he needs to give away at least 10% of that. And he has seen that the more books he gives away, eventually the more his books get out into the world and people recommend and pass his books along. So for those on the call who might have a book, a commitment to giving away as many of your own books as you can will obviously ensure that more people will see and read it and benefit from it. But although that is a luxury, I recognize.
And
the last one.
Yeah.
Thank you. So longevity is the one that we played around with that word. If you want to grow an impact, it's a long-term commitment. So I liked the word longevity because it's not something where, you can show up with a book and then disappear and expect that your work will continue to grow. If you want to grow an audience and have impact with people, you just need to show up over time. So that's why we had the word longevity. But for a half a minute, we talked about replacing the word longevity with the word like endurance or perseverance. And kind of the pushback I got when we talked about changing the word, although both make sense, you do need to endure in showing up with your message. You do need to persevere. Those seemed a little bit too hard. No one wants to be told that it's going to take perseverance. No one's going to want to be told that it's really a lot of hard work. So we eventually stayed with the word longevity. But for a half minute, we were toying with the idea of endurance.
I like longevity too, because it feels like a legacy word rather than just like a physical endurance word. And I know you're a marathon runner, so I'm sure those words come more naturally to you because you're used to that kind of training.
I am. And I have to tell you that I've completely reevaluated some of the words and phrases and analogies that I used in the past, because I used to say to authors like you, hey, marketing a book is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And guess what? I'm done with that language, because it's not a sprint, it's not a marathon. It's more like the commitment to train every day for the rest of your life. And thinking about a marathon, it has an end point. You finish it. Whereas I think that when you have work to do, a value in the world, maybe this particular book campaign is finished, but in terms of showing up to offer value to people, that's not anything that we're finished with.
Okay. So your book focuses mostly on the online presence that supplements people's other way of connecting with their people or audiences. Why does an online presence matter for authors in today's world?
Sure. Well, the main reason why an online presence matters is because it allows you to scale to audiences beyond the ones who already know you. And in the book, I talk about what I call the influence gap. What I've noticed is I meet a lot of authors and thought leaders, and they've done a really, really great job offline. They've been academics, or they've been leaders in organizations, or, they've been on the speaker circuit. And so they have these connections when they're in person with people that are really powerful and memorable. And then what happens is if you go online, their online presence does not match what they've done in the real world. So if we want to have the biggest possible impact with our lives overall, what we have to do is we have to not only build online, we have to not only build offline, we have to build both at the same time. So you will create the biggest possible impact for your message when you're able to do both of those things at once. And of course, it's not easy. If we're super successful in offline spaces, that takes up all of our energy and attention. So for people who have that really successful offline connection and opportunities, sometimes it requires that you have help. you might need an intern or an assistant who can ensure that you take those pictures or capture that thinking and then share that in online spaces. But when, online, the time barriers go away, the geography barriers go away. It all goes away because when you put content online, anybody can access it anytime and benefit from it.
That's so true. And being able to put snippets out there online helps create that word of mouth through sharing, but supplementing. I remember when I was a younger mother, there was a phrase about you can do it all as a mother, just not all at once. So there's sort of that flow of, sometimes that's inner, sometimes it's offline or online and offline. Sometimes you just got to take a break, I'm sure.
Yes, of course. And I thought of that Tuesday night, my team had a surprise party for me. And right away, when I got to the party, I handed off my phone to someone because I knew I wanted pictures. And, maybe there are some people who could like simultaneously be fully present at a party with their people and be posting it online. I couldn't. So, I compensated for that by in the morning sharing the experience and the photos with my online communities. So there's a time and place for both.
Well, I'm really glad that your book includes chapter 10, which is called Reach for Marginalized Voices, because it seems to acknowledge, it does acknowledge that creating an online following and expanding, to a huge audience isn't automatically easy for everyone and anyone. Can you tell us how that chapter came about?
Sure. And I don't remember the specifics, but as I was writing the book, I just became aware that I came to all these ideas from a place of extreme privilege. So I built my company beginning in 2012 and was able to do that because I had financial support and stability from my husband's income. And so I wasn't worried immediately about, making a lot of money. And, that allowed me to be generous as it relates to creating, sharing content for free. I could be generous because I had enough. And I realized that there are people for various reasons, whether it's their race or their gender identity or their socioeconomic status or their education background, they may not have the benefits and privilege of having the resources to be able to be generous. Or, even I interviewed a woman and she is of she was born in the United States, but her parents came from India. And what she shared with me that had never even occurred to me is some of the privilege associated with even growing an online following. So her experience was when she got on LinkedIn, she experienced like some stalking that was like unhealthy. And at the time, LinkedIn did not allow you to block connections. And so rather than deal with that kind of harassment that she was experiencing, she had to pull herself out of LinkedIn until LinkedIn had functionality that could allow her to feel more safe in online spaces. And like, we just don't even think about that. So as a result, her following grew slower. And then when she wanted to craft a book proposal and get a book deal, she was penalized because she didn't have the platform that a white man who had gotten started early on LinkedIn and wasn't fearful for that harassment might have had to deal with. And it was just a poignant reminder to me that we can never understand the limitations associated with coming from an identity that might be marginalized. And so it was important to me to kind of give space for that, and then also to challenge those of us who do come from a place of privilege or resources to think about in what ways we could amplify the voices of others, voices that deserve to be heard, and voices without which, we are all limited in our kind of understanding of the world and our development as humans. So we need the chance to hear from people who are different from us, and sometimes those stories and content is not amplified in the way that it could be.
Well, again, I'm really glad that you put that chapter in there. It's like an important piece of a bigger conversation. And that was one question that I wanted to ask you, is what's the bigger conversation that you hope your book is part of?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it. But first, I just want to talk a little bit more about the marginalized voices thing, because it was a very scary chapter to write. And, the whole topic of your series is creative courage. And it took courage to write about something that I didn't feel as confident about. It took courage to, start that conversation, even though I thought I was fumbling, even though I was worried that I could, potentially say it in not quite the right way. I mean, the beautiful thing, obviously, about having an editorial team is that you have those outside looks at your content to make it better. But, I was worried. Of course, you never want to offend someone by what you write, or, if what I said fell short or still was kind of blind to the realities that other people experience. I didn't want to do that either. So it definitely took creative courage to say this chapter belongs in the book and I'm going to find a way to write it, even though I might not get it completely right. It's still the journey of saying, I'm going to try to have this.
When I was writing The Courage Way, I realized that there are different types of courage, and an author named Rollo May named physical courage, social courage, moral courage, creative courage, which was the name of his book. And then there was the fifth, collective courage. And it strikes me that you need all of those, or a blend of all of those at different times, but that your book touches on all of that.
Yes, I hope so. In terms of the conversation, the bigger conversation that I want my book to be a part of, I'm really inspired by just thinking about the way that each of us can help the world be better when we bring our best ideas in a generous way to others. And I would love it if my book really inspires people to consider what's possible for them and to show up in ways that add to the world. As it relates to the topic of, helping amplify marginalized voices, I don't know that I'm ready to lead that conversation, but I want to listen to the conversations that are happening. The other thing, and this is probably nerdy and not as like globally beneficial to the world, but I'm very inspired by the idea of the way that content can be flexible and repurposed and reused over time. That's chapter 7 in my book. And toward the end of that chapter, I talk about the idea that repurposing life is possible. So when we can bring our best experiences, our worst experience, kind of all of our experiences into the content that we're creating, that's when the content will be most powerful. And so I'm already thinking about my next book. And as I think about my next book, I think about people like you, Shelly. I don't know if those who are on the call know about the memoir that you wrote, but I devoured that. And I think that one of the reasons why it was so powerful is that it was so real in sharing your journey of dealing with your then husband's illness. And so I think that the content that kind of makes the biggest impact in the world is whatever's closest to you. So I hope that in the future I can, be part of this conversation of giving people the courage to share about their life experiences in ways that can help others who might be experiencing similar struggles.
Well, thanks for mentioning the memoir, because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. Is I noticed that you tend to work with thought leaders and business sort of nonfiction type titles and authors. So do you feel like your framework applies to any genre of book, like memoir or children's books?
I think for memoirs, certainly the ideas in reach would apply to authors who have written a memoir. And I have had some fiction authors I've worked with who say that my concepts are helpful for them as well. But I think an area of growth for me as I move ahead is to figure out in what ways can I apply the concepts that I've put to work really well with authors and thought leaders. In what way can I make those more transferable, more easily transferable to other genres? I think that no matter what kind of book you write, getting clear about your brand, which I talk about in the book, is really critical. No matter what kind of book you write, the kind of tactics that you would use to share it are all the same. Like, you want to have your own website that you own and control. You want to have an email list of people who want to hear from you. And all of those work, whether it's a memoir or a children's book or a fiction book or a nonfiction book. So there's a huge amount of transferability. I think the big gap would be most of the examples and stories I have are from those business book authors.
You do have some memoir authors in there, though, especially like the one you were just mentioning about repurposing your life. She was a memoir. Uh, well, actually, she has a memoir, but she hasn't published it yet, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yes. But it's memoir type content.
Right. Well, I loved that your advice by the person who wrote your foreword was to read the book with a highlighter, because I did that. And I also turned down tons of pages. I just have to show brand, because you wrote, your personal brand already exists. Your personal brand is your authentic self, who you are, all the quirks and characteristics that define you, both your strengths, triumphs, foibles, and imperfections. So like that gives me courage to think, I don't have to create something fake or something that I feel like is going to be, well, more street cred than what I can do just as being myself. So being authentic and whole. So while you're answering that, I just want to say, if people have questions, go ahead and start putting them into the chat. But Becky, how did this sense of being yourself as your personal brand show up for you? How does that show up for you all the time with your online presence?
Sure. Well, I'm trying to think back. So when I was blogging about leadership back in around 2009, like I think that was the first introduction that I had to brand and branding. And I remember writing a blog post because at the time, my husband and I were preparing to move from Chicago, where we lived at the time, to Michigan, where we live now. And when you are getting your house ready to sell, how you stage it. So it occurred to me as we were staging the house, and when my kitchen was cleaner than it had ever been before, with the counters completely clear and polished, that was somewhat of an inauthentic kind of look, right? And that was kind of when the light bulb moment went off for me about personal brand, because I'm not exactly sure why. Just thinking about the comparison between how my house might look if you showed up on any given day and how it looks when staged. And I realized that we all put a lot of pressure on ourselves as it relates to online presence to show the staged version of ourselves. And in some ways that's unavoidable. It's not possible to air everything of our lives in online spaces. It's maybe not safe. It's maybe not, what people need. But what I learned was the more I could bring my authentic self, and, most of the time I show up in a t-shirt because that's who I am. Or, the more I could really share the real experiences and emotions, the more that people could identify with me because I was real. I think people don't really want to connect to someone fake. And the way to build connections, which are critical for this online world, is to be as real as we can. So, I think that potentially sometimes I've erred too much on the side of that, especially as it relates to sharing like my book marketing journey. Like I want to tell the real stuff. I want to share like the fact that, on Thursday of my launch week, when I saw my sales rank, dropping, that's discouraging or, concerning or whatever. I think the more real we can be, the more kind of relatable we are, because otherwise people like think that creating content or drawing an audience is impossible for them because they're not good enough. And the truth is that you're already good enough. And, if you see people projecting perfection, it's just not real.
Well, and I think that showing up as yourself is part of creating trust, because we trust people who we have that personal connection with, who we see not only their credibility or their expertise, but also their humanity. And
yes.
Trust building with our audiences is like not a thing to manipulate. It's just a thing that we want to do.
Yes. And something to be careful of, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, of all of your advice, what has been the hardest for you to follow yourself?
Oh, wow. That is a really excellent question. So, I mean, this is kind of a minor one, and then maybe as I share it, I'll think of something else. But in reflecting on my own like book marketing journey and approach, I've coached authors about the importance of bulk orders and being willing to ask people to buy their book in bulk. And when it came time to do that part of my campaign, I felt very reluctant, and like fearful, and I just put it off and didn't really do a good job on that part of the campaign. I think the other thing, I was talking to a client a few weeks back, and we've been coaching him to get on TikTok because we're seeing that for some of our authors, that can be a really great platform. But I personally don't love video except for this kind of video. Like, I love the interactive video when I can forget that the camera is here. But in terms of like setting up a tripod and filming video, and I know the camera is there, I can't stand it. And my client kind of called me out. He's like, well, you have to smoke the stuff you're selling. Which I thought was a funny phrase, but like, well, but that particular thing, I'm not ready to do that yet. So that's some advice that has been harder for me to follow. Like, video performs really, really well, but I'm reluctant to make that my primary content sharing mode. I much prefer interactive. I like podcasting. I like writing. So
I get that. I mean, I think we have to be true to ourselves, and we get the courage to do something a little more that stretches us more by doing the things where we have our strengths first.
Yes. And, my team asked me to do a video for launch day for Instagram, and I filmed it. It probably took me 30 or 40 takes and tries. It took over an hour to get like a 30-second video, and I hated it, but I sent it off to be posted anyway. So sometimes you just have to like, take a deep breath and move ahead.
So true. So we have a question from Megan. Would you share an example of a commitment to consistency you've made and how you determined that it was right for you?
Sure. Well, I would be glad to share that with you. I would say that sometimes it's an adaptation or a discovery driven process. So in the early days of my company, I made a commitment, I believe, to like a monthly newsletter. And that was something that felt doable and possible. And we did that for a long time until we had different goals. And at that time, I worked with a coach or consultant who said we should do 2 or 3, what she called nurture emails a week. And I thought, you know what, I cannot do 2 or 3 emails a week. It's too much for me. And so at that time, we shifted to a weekly newsletter, and that has worked well. I think if you make a commitment to a consistent approach and you can't follow through, that's a clue that you need to reevaluate and try something else. So, at the beginning of my book marketing journey, I decided that I would blog twice a month at my personal domain, beckyrobinson.com. And I never did it at all. And that was like, okay, here's a clue. That is not sustainable for me. And so I came up with something, different instead to share the journey. So I don't know, Megan, if that's what you were hoping for, but, sometimes you just need to try. If it's not working, you can reevaluate and pull back. Or the other thing I do is, tell people start with something that you can get done. So like if what you want is to do content weekly, but you can do content monthly, then start doing content monthly. And if that works really well, then start doing it bi-monthly. It's far better to like start smaller than to make a big commitment and then end up falling short.
And I think it changes too, just in terms of what your goals are. So book sales aren't necessarily the only goal. I mean, it can be to spread news about other things that you're doing, or just get your feet wet with sharing your voice, or just creating more of a following, asking for engagement. It doesn't have to have the same reason, and maybe different reasons have different efforts, right?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. When I was first getting started blogging, I would go through sprints where I would blog every day like Dan Rockwell does. And part of the reason was I wanted to get a lot of content out at once. I wanted to build a body of work and share my point of view, but that was just for a season. So there definitely can be changes over time in terms of how you commit to showing up with content. Like this week, when I committed to showing up with content like 10 times more frequent than I normally would, because it's a launch week.
Well, I know that I did like a 40-day stint on Instagram. I was posting in December and January these words that my mom had put on a list and given me. And I did this as a way of, after she died, just like reconnecting with her. So it was a really creative process. And I loved doing that, but I spent a lot of time on it too. And then when the words were done, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what else to say. So I thought it was going to like jumpstart me into this creativity of like consistent posting every day. And at the end, it was like, I'm complete with that. I guess I need to think of the next thing that I feel I can have a sustainable effort with.
For sure. I think the most important thing is just not to disappear. So it's difficult to get traction if you have any kind of like protracted period where you're not showing up at all. So, and I've noticed that with some of the clients that we've served, like they have a book to market and they show up with a flurry of activity and then they disappear to write the next book and they show up again. So that's not as effective as if they would have shown up over time in a consistent way.
So your book is full of stories of other authors, and I love that you describe yourself in the book at one point as being a beginning beginner yourself. So I know that was years ago, but where does a beginning beginner even know where to start, and how did you get started?
Sure. So I was definitely a beginning beginner when I showed up online in 2009. And part of the reason was I hadn't really clarified the topics that I wanted to contribute about, nor did I really have experience on those topics. So if I were someone who wanted to build influence online, but I wasn't really clear or sure what topics I would share about yet, I would really start with like curiosity of, what do I know about or what do I want to learn about that I could share with others? And I would give myself permission to not have anything to say yet. If I look at some of my early blog posts, some of them were really terrible. I didn't really know what to say or how to say it. And I think giving yourself permission to figure it out, giving yourself permission to discover it is really helpful. And along the way, if you can get feedback about what does resonate with people, sometimes that can give you a clue as to the direction you should go in. I would say of all the writing that I've done or blogging that I've done, the majority of it has ended up being about building online influence and connections. Whereas at the beginning, I thought I would be writing about, leadership or whatever. So definitely as a beginner, you need to give yourself permission and time to discover what it is that you want to share about. But then as you go, I think, at clarifying at each stage, what that niche is. And Shelly, you and I have had conversations about that, about how you're not quite sure. Well, maybe you are now, but at different times you haven't been sure about where you should focus your content creation energy, and that's normal. And I actually had a question on an event earlier today from someone who said, well, what about when I want to rebrand? Well, of course, we might want to reinvent our lives at various times, and discover new content that we're excited about or energetic about, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that we adequately clue in our online audiences to the fact that we're making a shift.
I remember talking to an author who said that she really loved blogging for a year without telling anybody she was doing it, because it helped her just get in the habit of it and practice with it. And then when she was really ready to go public with it, she felt like she had her legs underneath her.
Yeah,
And
what a
she
great
had,
idea.
yeah. And so and I have one author doing that now too, is just like post a little every day and tell me about it and I'll cheer you on. And then when you decide to go live, you'll have this archive of other posts as well that people could continue to explore.
What a great idea. I think, of course, it didn't make it into the 4 commitments, but as you say that, patience. I think the thing that I encounter most often is that people think that showing up online is going to instantly lead to whatever outcome they want. So whether that's book sales or, growing their business or attracting clients or whatever, people just want to jump to that instantly. And it does take patience.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I loved about your book was toward the end, you talked about the importance of celebrating. And it seems like it actually takes courage to stop and celebrate instead of just go with that cultural message of on to the next thing. So I'd love to know, what are you doing that's joyful as part of your becoming a new author?
Well, it's all joyful, or at least it feels that way this week. I was so surprised, like so many people like sent me flowers and gifts and cards and notes, and just taking the time to savor those has been really joyful. Shelly, I think I told you that when this call's over, it's like my last event of the week, and I'm going to meet up with some colleagues and go out to celebrate. And again, my colleagues had the surprise party, which I had no idea about, which was so lovely. I think apart from the prodding of my community and my family, I might not be celebrating well. The other thing I did, and I'm not sure if it was the smartest thing I ever did or the stupidest thing I ever did, but I signed up for a half marathon on Sunday. And I'm a little bit worried because I have an Achilles injury, and then also it's going to be really hot here on Sunday, and I'm not really ready with either of those two kind of physical factors to show up and run a half marathon. But I was thinking this afternoon about how, what if I just spend the 13 miles, whether I run them or walk them, and just kind of savor the experiences of the week and reflect on, you know, what I've done and what I want to do next. I think I'd like to try to make every one of those miles, if I actually make it to the start line, a celebration.
Love that. That's a great idea.
I saw a question. Did you see that one too? I like the question, so I want to make sure we get to it. From Leslie.
Thank you, Leslie. What can you say about whether or how to integrate content that reveals who we are as people outside of the content of our books? How important is that?
Yeah, I would say it's hugely important, Leslie. And I would also say that we have choices about how much we want to reveal. So as I've crafted my online presence, there are a few topics, you know, about myself as a person that I'm willing to share about, and then some that I'm not. So I very carefully guard my family. And I don't share a ton about my family in my posts, apart from, you know, occasionally on Facebook to my friends only. But in terms of like my public persona, I don't like hide that I have a husband and kids, but I don't really talk a lot about them for their privacy. But beyond that, I try to bring absolutely as much as I can about myself as a person to the world, you know, my faith perspective, my love of running, my love of coffee, my love of chocolate, you know, my love of reading, the books I like, you know, stuff about the geography in which I live. I think that if you can choose to bring more of yourself and not just focus on the content of the book, it makes you more relatable, and it helps people to connect with you more easily. So hobbies, interests, likes, dislikes, you know, whatever you're willing to share, I think really helps you to be like a more well-rounded person. And in it, I think people want to know the person behind the book that they're reading. I have a good friend who's a fiction author. Her name is Stephanie Lansome, and I've gotten to know her just through working with her as a client. But I just cheer for her whenever she posts like a photo of herself or her cats, and it's not just about her books. I think it's so fun, and that's what readers are really looking for.
Well, that's part of just being a whole author. You know, there's the life that you're leading, and the book isn't your entire life. It's a big piece of who you are, but you're all of this wonderful stuff.
Well, and you were all that stuff before you became an author. Like, I don't even know if I've let it sink in yet that I'm an author.
The courage to admit you're an author.
Exactly.
Oh. Well, if there's anything else, please jot it in. Oh, Islet, great. I've been blogging daily, and while it's tough, I'm loving it because of the ripples. It makes me not want to write another book. How do you see the industry shifting, if at all, for us to reach a very unique reader?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say that, you know, part of what kept me for a long time from writing a book was knowing how hard it was to attract an audience and sell books, you know, having walked alongside authors and seen how much work it takes. And so what I might say to you, Islet, is that it's a good idea to try to test your ideas more through sharing your content online to figure out if that next book is viable, see what kind of feedback you get, see if you're able to grow the people who are following you and listening to you. I would also say that, sometimes we write a book not because of the ability to grow an audience, but just we do it for ourselves. And so it may be that if you're reluctant to write a second book, maybe write it anyway, like for the creativity of writing it, and then you can decide in what way you want to promote it. So I don't know if that's answering your question exactly, but I think finding out where those unique readers are or knowing who they are before we write the book can help us more easily reach the writer when we get there. 4 books have been enough. 4 books is amazing. Wow.
So one of the questions is like, is the industry shifting in terms of, publishing it, we know is shifting, but is it more to ebooks? Is it more to, I don't know. I know there's paper shortages, books. There's a hunger for books though, since COVID seemed to create a resurgence around that. What other changes have you seen, over 10 years or more?
Sure. Well, in terms of what I've seen in the industry, I think what I've seen is that it just gets harder and harder because every year there are more books on Amazon. And so it might become noisier and noisier. So for people who might still be considering writing a book, what I've noticed is that the more unique the book is, the easier it is for it to get traction. So I was working with some authors not long ago, and they have pioneered this new model of healing developmental trauma. And there really aren't that many books out there about that. And so what I'm seeing is they're getting a lot of traction and success because the therapists and their networks are hungry for content on the topic because it's groundbreaking research. So what I'm noticing is, like the more unique a book is, and obviously the audience being ready for it, the easier it is. In terms of modes of books, paperback, ebook, audiobook, I am seeing a big surge as it relates to audiobooks, and particularly in business book spaces. People are busy, and so audiobooks make it much easier for people to consume that content. And maybe that's across all genres where, in this age of podcasting where people are used to listening, even though many people don't have commutes, it does seem to still be a thing that people enjoy receiving their content in audio formats. So I think that we'll continue to see surges with audiobooks. And, if you're an author who's only done books in print and ebook format, it could be valuable to bring new life to your title by creating an audiobook to reach that segment who will never pick up a paper book or an ebook.
You recorded your own audiobook, didn't you? I mean, it was your...
I did. I'm getting good feedback back about it too, that people really enjoy listening to a book narrated by the author. It was a big commitment, but I'm really glad I did it.
That's great. Well, I want to honor everybody's time. We've hit an hour, and I'm just so grateful, Becky, for you being here today and sharing your story and your wisdom with all of us.
Yeah, it was wonderful. So if people are curious about getting my book, and I don't mean to make a sales pitch, but I was able to get some free audiobook codes from my publisher, Berrett-Koehler Publishers. We have a few left. So if anyone's on the call and you want to email me after, and you've bought my book in print or ebook, I'd be happy to try to get you one of those audiobook codes so that you can also experience the audio version if that's of interest to you. And I would love to connect with each of you personally, like on LinkedIn or wherever you're showing up online. Please feel free to reach out and connect to me if I can help you.
So finding you online would be at weavinginfluence.com. And what else is easy to remember?
Yeah, the easiest place to find out about the book and the content associated with the book is at beckyrobinson.com/book. And the other thing, again, I don't mean to make a sales pitch, but at the end of every chapter in my book, I have a QR code, and it links to a course where we have more than 50 additional learning resources if you want to dig deeper on these topics. So that would be beckyrobinson.com/book. And once you have the book in any format, ebook, audiobook, or print book, you'll be able to get access to the free course.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you have the courage to do your sales pitch, because that takes courage and it's important. And so I've also plugged in some quick links to buy the book if you haven't yet. And please go back and leave a review afterwards, after you've had time to read it. And I'm glad that you mentioned the QR codes, because that content that you're offering is just fantastic. In addition, I mean, it's the equivalent of an online course. So very cool.
Yes. Yeah. And I just have to give a shout out to Lisa. I think she's the person who came because I invited my list. Lisa's been on my launch team and really supportive with leaving reviews. And Shelly, you left an Amazon review for me. I was so pleased when I saw that. Thank you.
You're so welcome. I'm happy to. So, well, thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you've learned something about creative courage for your inner author, and also how to share your message with more courage by reaching as many people as possible. With that, I'll just leave one more question for everyone to ponder. What would you do with more courage?
I love that.
All right. Bye-bye for now.